Yeah.
So, yeah, just when Clive Marks started taking an interest later on, I mean, that's what got me interested actually.
Yeah.
I read those articles, and he approached the minister to get some information about where the program was at.
Yes, that was 2009, I think.
2009.
Yeah.
It was all a bit over the place, wasn't it?
Yeah. He put out a very, very long and lengthy article on Tasmanian Times called "The Fox That Wasn't There," and it was really trying to tease out what he believed to be the basis of determining presence or absence, and how you would validate that, and how the SCAT program could, in the finding of DNA Fox positive scats, would be an indication of bona fide presence of foxes. And so he wrote to the minister and asked some pretty telling questions, and I think he got flicked off fairly abruptly by the minister. But the minister did open up to say, well, you know, we no longer really consider that this index event of importations of fox cubs was the basis of presence of foxes in Tasmania. In fact, they could well have been here for 100+ years, and that it's just that devils are in decline and these animals are starting to emerge out of the landscape, and they're here. So this was giving them another storyline to not have to go back over that old storyline that was now considered to be perhaps not as meritorious as it once was. So that was the beginning, and I then got involved because Clive approached me and said, well, you know, where do you come from? What's your expertise? And I gave him the pack drill of my interest as a pathologist and looking at the forensics. And then he then sort of started to want to liaise with Alan Johnson, who was then the manager, to say, well, you know, can I help? And he was getting basically fobbed off and saying, don't call us, we'll call you. Thank you for your interest, but we've got everything under control. And he was asked to basically come and show and tell his what he was concerned about and what contributions he could make to the program at their scientific advisory committee, which was heavily weighted towards the people from the invasive animals CRC, with Tony Peacock and Stephen Sarre and Glenn Saunders. So it became a situation where they'd already had, by that stage there'd been 2 reviews and one further review coming. There was one done by in 2003 by Kinnear, another one in 2006 by the Invasive Animal CRC, and a third one that was going to be done by the New Zealand Landcare group, and then there was the PAC inquiry. So all of them had sort of basically given them a sense that, well, continue business as usual, but they had trawled over the evidence. But the critical evidence now became the scats. The detection of scats was the thing that gave them the sense that foxes were widespread and at low density, but they were elusive, intelligent animals, and they were extremely hard to pick up by any other technique but presence of fox scats. And this is what the criticism that Clive was saying was, how many scats have you found along your bait lines? Because he said, if these animals are going to be, if you're thinking that they're being taken along the bait lines where you're putting buried baits, you'd expect to find shits in those areas too. And of course they weren't able to demonstrate that any of them had been found along those bait lines. They were always, and the majority of the scats that were found, the 61 DNA Fox positive scats, came out of a 3-year survey ran from 2008, 2009, 2010 in 3 different parts of the state, covering what they claimed to be 24,000 square kilometres of Tasmania. They picked up over 9,700 carnivore scats using dogs and different techniques of transecting across land, and they were all bundled up, sent off to the Institute of Applied Ecology in Canberra to look for DNA indicative of fox, and they found 61 of these to be DNA fox positive. So that was sort of an interesting thing, because Clive was saying, well, did you ever find clusters of scats? You know, did you ever find a situation where you might have found the genotype of the multiple scats with the same genotype? In other words, a fingerprint that was identifiable to one fox multiply crapping in the same place. And no, they hadn't. Had they found male and female? Yes, they'd found, there was a sex marker that they'd found, so it was definitely male and female DNA found, and that they were able to basically send some of those scats off in the early time to Barbara Triggs to do mammal hair analysis on, and she was able to confirm that some of those scats, 5 of them, contained fox hairs. So there was a lot of things that said, well, you know, those scats are potentially fox scats. But some of those scats, we don't really know whether they were fox scats or potentially contaminated with fox DNA. And the difficulty was to get anybody to respond to those significant technical questions we had.
Yeah, I've lost my train of thought there. There was, there's only been 15 really that they've been able to identify as being from different ones.
Genetics, yeah, by genotyping, yeah.
What about as far as area goes, like in density, like how close to each other the ones that have been found? Because, potentially they could be from the same fox, but just because they haven't been able to get the genotype from it.
Well, the thing is there's 2 tests, as I understand it. The first test is what they call the species test, which is what they do is there's a sequence of the mitochondrial DNA which is quite robust and is able to pass through into feces and be detected. And so this is something that is originating as fox DNA that's mitochondrial in origin, and that tells you that. And what it's an amplification process. So they do what they call a polymerase chain reaction, and they put in the primer sequence, and then get whatever's there will be copied, and then it's recopied and recopied and recopied. And depending on how many cycles they put this thing through their genome sequencer, they can amplify it up so that it's a big signal. And so what is that they get a number of bars on their gel electrophoresis that says that these bars are sequenced out as being fox DNA. So 61 of them have come up with those results that are saying there's fox positive genetically. And what we've questioned technically is how do they know that they are, by another test, confirmatory of being fox? The finding of guard hairs of foxes in these feces, when any animal grooms, it picks up its own fur and swallows them, and they're passed in the feces. So Barbara Triggs was able to confirm that 5 of them were fox positive by another test. So what I've been rabbiting on about in a lot of my blogs on Tassie Times is about 2-factor analysis. That's a 2-factor analysis. Confirms that at least 5 of those were definitely fox feces. So it then begs the question, was there any follow-up done on those 5 fox feces that demonstrated that they could find extra fox feces in those locations, and that maybe if any of them had the genotype test is another test done in WA, which they've taken about 5 different other sequences, again amplification and gene sequencing, allowing them to actually check the amino acid sequences. And if they can show that, or nucleotide sequences I should say, then if they could show that they are identical fingerprinting, so that the sequences are the same, they can say the genotypes from that scat and that scat are the same, so presumably they are most likely to have come from the same animal. And that's the thing. They've got 15 of those, but they're all different, and they come from a variety of locations across Tasmania. Clive and I and others are wanting to get the definitive data so that we can see what the spread is, and that's what we're requesting now. And we also want to get an explanation for how they've discounted the possibility of what we call false positives. So in other words, where contaminations is likely to occur. And we know that things, because the task force has used so much fox scat for the purposes of training dogs, and they've done this fox scat degradation study, which they've allowed scats to be fox scats to be put in the environment and watch how long they take to degrade and whether they can still detect DNA in them. All these things contaminate the environment. So if you think you're also looking for genuine fox scats, and you've got poor hygiene around DNA,
and not to mention the office being full of fox parts, so
exactly,
people going out to the field are covered in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is the difficulty we had with, and the fact is you've got 61 scats over something like 5 or 6 years. They started in 2005, and I think they're still getting results coming in 2011. So they've got 9,500, 10,000 scats being looked at. Only 61 of them are definitive fox based on that test. So we are really questioning the veracity of that information, because it is what they're claiming to be the basis of their, not only the presence of foxes, but their whole validation for maintaining a bait program. The final piece of evidence I gave to the PAC inquiry, they said to me, is we want you to put something up that is, a solution. What do you think? And I said, well, the big problem is, does this program have the support of the community, and will it work? So first of all, what do people think of it, and will it work? Because any controversial piece of policy, you've got to basically ask those two questions. And on the basis of what I'd read in the papers and what I'd heard on Talkback Radio, the public confidence was very, very low. And all the public meetings were getting quite a lot of heckling and cynicism thrown at them. But then I said, well, okay, be that as it may, even if they are convinced that the program, even though it's controversial and they haven't got the backing of the community, will it work? Will buried meat baits deployed arbitrarily across the landscape work? And I said, well, I personally don't think it works, because you've got no statutory underpinning. If this was an exotic disease and it was foot and mouth detected on a dairy property on the northwest coast today, the Chief Veterinary Officer could pull down a statute book and say, I can declare this as an infected area, that is an infected property. I have to compel that owner to give me complete oversight of his management and operations. All the police and the SES and all emergency services must be compelled to support containment of this activity. With foxes, there was no underpinning statutorily. Farmers could say, piss off, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And the deployment of the meat baits was never proven to be ever an effective eradication tool. It could kill foxes, no doubt about it. So I came to the conclusion that they didn't have those two questions answered in the affirmative. So it was a problem.
Yes, and it still is, although they seem to be making moves in other directions now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot where I was going with that too. I mean, I may as well just go on to, where they're at the moment.
Yeah.
They have decided to, for various reasons, to move into dealing with feral cats as well. So this is something that's obviously been spoken about for a long time. Can you talk about how long that's been on the radar?
A long time. Feral cats have been a problem in Tasmania ever since I've been here. I came in 1980. And toxoplasmosis was a significant issue for farmers with abortions in maiden ewes. You got abortion storms running 60-70% of first lambing ewes aborting or producing dead lambs, weak lambs. And and that was due to toxoplasma. Toxoplasma is only transmitted by by cats in the environment. We know it's a public health issue. It can cause congenital infections in women that have got no exposure to cats before. There was a problem with wildlife. We knew that wildlife were impacted by toxo, and that probably caused local extinctions of wombats. It's a serious threatening process for the eastern barred bandicoot. It causes seasonal mortalities of paddymmelon and Bennett's wallaby, and it's just another one of these issues where a disease caused by an active predator is a double whammy. So whatever they don't kill with toxo, they're actually actively predating. So small birds, ground nesting birds, skinks, frogs, as well as small mammals, antechinus, rodents, anything up to bettong size would be taken by a cat. So I was concerned, the Greens were concerned, environmentalists were concerned, but cat control was never an issue. The Greens started to get very public about it in about 2004, 2005. They brought in private members' bills to get legislation, constantly got knocked back. And then in, I think, 2009, it was finally brought in as a piece of legislation. It was supported by all three parties. And that was before a minority government, Labor-Green government began. But the government didn't want to promulgate the legislation, so it's just sat on the books as something to do. It was about desexing, registration, not cat curfewing, but at least getting some control on breeding of cats, and so that the topping up of cats into the broader environment wasn't going to happen, and long term to look at containment of cats on environments that were rich in biodiversity. So they've already controlled them on Macquarie Island, on Tasman Island. They'll probably do some peninsulas where they can actually control cats with maybe some fencing or something. So and this has been done in other parts of Australia, like Western Australia, South Australia. So it's doable. So the minute cats were brought into the play for foxes, it was a bit of a godsend for everyone. And it probably gets them off the hook a bit, because they can still keep looking for foxes, but they're getting real on something that has been a problem for probably 100 years plus.
Yeah. Yeah. It's long overdue, and it's always been seen as sort of an exit strategy in a way, or a way out, because they've sort of put themselves in a pretty awkward position where they can't really come up with the tangible evidence of what's actually working.
The big change was when Craig Elliott took over as the manager, because he was a former copper, a senior copper in Queensland, and worked in biosecurity up there, and I think it didn't make sense to him. The sense was that he was really questioning how the program sorted itself out, and although he was politically trying to be diplomatic and not going over the old ground, he realised that the program was bunkered. In terms of all the things we just talked about, the controversy, the lack of public confidence in the program, and the fact that none of the evidence made sense. Now, even if one piece of evidence could be validated and corroborated, and given a sense that there was a chain of custody that was really quite authentic, then you would say, well, it would have improved the morale of the whole program and given people a reason for knowing that there was a fox out there and we had to get it. But it hasn't happened in 11 years. Well, in my view, it hasn't happened in 11 years.
I suppose we better touch on just wrapping up.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk, a lot of rumours and stuff about fabrication of evidence, a lot of mispropriety by staff. Have you seen evidence of this? Do you think it's anything that's worth following up? There's some very serious allegations which, if they were true, I mean, in the context of what's gone on and the amount of money being spent, a lot of time and resources and stuff.
Okay.
Where do you see it? Where do you, is there anything that can be gained by going back over those things?
Yes, I think it's a duty of responsibility to review it, purely and simply because at the time when Ian Rist first raised the matter of the potential for fabrication of scats to be occurring, he was swatted down pretty heavily by none other than Tony Peacock. And he did it publicly in letters, and he also did it on his own private blogs. He had a Feral Talks blog site in which he, in my view, ridiculed Ian and made him look like a fool. But then what was quite clear subsequently, when the Liberals asked for FOI information, it was clear that not only was Tony Peacock aware that importations of fox scats were coming into Tasmania, but that they were using them for training purposes for dogs, and that other fox products like fox urine, fox feet, fox carcasses were all being brought in. So it became an embarrassment. Now, I'm not saying that is prima facie evidence that any fabrication occurred as a result of people in the task force.
It just sounds like mismanagement.
It just sounds like mismanagement.
The fact that, they didn't come out and admit it in the first place. I mean, the difference between bringing a few products in, doing it on the record, or sending a lot of people over to the mainland at great expense for training. The difficulties that I have, the two difficulties I have, and purely based on the evidence that's provided, is those 5 scats that have been found by Barbara Triggs to contain fox hairs that were found in 2008, and they all have been found on the northwest coast. And there's only you can only conclude 2 things from those. There's either fox or foxes in that environment from Boat Harbour to, I think, just east of Devonport. There's fox or foxes in that environment that have not been detected by any other means, or that they were planted. There's no other conclusion I can come to. The other one that concerns me is the effort that the task force went to demonstrate for the magic reel company that was filming Feral Peril documentary, that there was a bona fide sighting that was corroborated by a fox scat at Kenilworth, and I think that was in 2007. And that story is concerning for me because that particular scat that was shown in that documentary doesn't exist on their record as a DNA fox positive scat, and they did no follow up to demonstrate the presence of any other scats at that area, and yet the referral was 7 days. They got the test results 7 days later. Well, it sounds like the whole thing was a setup for the film, and I think to some degree that's been admitted, hasn't it? That it was a stage. They said it was a reenactment for the purposes of the filming, but it's still SARE documents that scat as being a Kenilworth scat that was located there, but the number is no longer the one that was filmed, and the one that is recorded as their number from the Canberra entry are 2 different numbers, and yet the number that correlates back to the FEP's chronology of all the 61 scats, that scat does not appear. So I guess what I'm concerned about really is that there is more confusion about the merit of any of that evidence being credible, and so now Ian and others are claiming that people who are part of the task force have fabricated. Now, at the moment, none of those individuals have come forward and provided a statutory declaration. I think they should do so if they believe that. I mean, the trouble with Tasmania is it is a small location, and that people feel limited in their employment prospects. They're hardly going to blot their copybook. Generally, if they're considered a former disgruntled employee with low credibility, then they're going to be dismissed no matter what they do. So it's a difficult one to prove, and so I'm left with the belief that you've got to go with
with a lot of suppositional senses of this evidence doesn't add up for the two cases that I've indicated, and that on no instance have they been able to corroborate that any of that scat evidence or any of their baiting program impact has led them to finding either a live fox or a dead fox. And of course now, if the program is going into a sort of a care and maintenance monitoring program, it's a bit like the cry wolf story. If you cry wolf again, people are going to say, the bar is a lot higher now for you guys to come up to. You're going to have to prove a higher level of credibility or validation than when you started off, because the precautionary principles run out from the precautionary principle. It can only work when you think that the risk of doing nothing outweighs the certainty of waiting, And people gave them the benefit of the doubt. I think scientists gave them the benefit of the doubt. I think the community gave them the benefit. Even probably politicians gave them the benefit of the doubt. Whereas 11 years on, you can't now say, we've now found a fox, because it's saying, well, you've been telling us that everything you've done has got rid of the foxes, and now you're saying they're still here. It confuses everybody, and it's going to be hard for them to pick up the story again.
Yep. I mean, given the amount of money that's been spent, it's a pretty interesting research activity, really.
Well, that's where Clive's going with this.
Yeah.
Because what he's done is he's gone back to looking at comparable situations where sensationalism and overcooking scenarios have led to money being appropriated. I did a posting which Lindsay did put up on Tassie Times. It was pretty close to the bone, and I called it the embarrassment of embezzlement. Embezzling is a very, very hard claim. It's saying that you fabricate either a storyline or an evidence to give somebody a sense that it's important to do something than not do anything. And whether it was, as you say, it was a mismanagement and a stuff up and just very, very poor transparency that led them down the track that they've now got themselves to, or whether it was through fraudulent activity. And of course, you've got this other sense that you have a number of people in our community in Tasmania who had a real vendetta against Parks and Wildlife, particularly their enforcement officers. And so when you go back to the story of the hunters that were involved, going back to even the Bosworth incident, people who had really intentional hatred and a sense of wanting to do something to make them look foolish and stupid. And in a way, that's where I think I said something about, whether you were a gatekeeper, a gamekeeper, or a poacher. In this case, they've collaborated. If they have, they've collaborated quite well, because they're both on the same side when it comes to getting either kudos or status or money. And in the case of Mr. Bosworth, he's already acknowledged that he was before the courts a number of times for firearms offences and wildlife misdemeanours and was being tracked by them very, very regularly. He's there in their offenders file for being a multiple offender and having fines, confiscation of firearms. And yet here's a person that they put so much veracity in the claim that he and his offsider saw a fox, shot a fox, then came back 10 days later and found the dead fox. Now, again, this is the gamekeeper and poacher storyline that come together. And it came at a time when that was the one that introduced the sense that it was an endemic species found in this decomposing remains. Now, when I've gone through that, I've gone back and talked to the person who identified those remains. I've talked to other biologists. It's a confusing mess, and again, it leaves you with the sense that that this because the evidence no longer exists, it can't be corroborated. The chain of custody is very problematic. The pathologist transfers the information, gives these in-trail materials across to Parks and Wildlife officials, who then find this material, send it off to somebody. You know, it's got to be speculative, because there's a potential. You've got to either accept the recognizance and truthfulness of the people involved, and say, you know, that their track record is of honesty and being good citizens, or there's a chance that they have fabricated and falsified. Now, that was the original. One of the reasons I got involved in this originally was when I started to investigate that in 2004 and presented a document to Ivan Dean and Tony Fletcher, who was the MLC for Murchison at the time. And it just so happened that when that information went into the public arena, the individual who was central to that investigation of taking the witness statements from the individuals involved in the shooting, who took part in collecting the entrails and sending them to the person who looked at the stomach content, resigned within 7 days. Now, I find that remarkable. I just find it remarkable, because, and then I say, well, okay, look, everything being as it is, let's just go back to this really number one exhibit. This is the exhibit that says when the director of Parks and Wildlife, Peter Mooney, comes out and says, we've found endemic species in the remains, and he says, well, found Pseudomys higginsi, only found. Well, where is the exhibit? It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore.
That's right.
This is the difficulty I have, and the whole thing is then that story becomes entrenched as being, we've found these remains, it's definitely a fox that lived in Tasmania, it was definitely shot by this man who had difficulty with Parks and Wildlife, you know, etc., etc. You've got to say, is this a reliable witness? Is the person who collected this material reliable in what he did? And what is the veracity of the evidence? Well, none of it can be shown to be the way it is. I just have great difficulty with that one. Great difficulty, because it came at a time when we had that the sense of that photograph of the two hunters being photographed by Longford Sign.
St Helens as well.
With the St Helens situation, we had, you know, and the embarrassment of public officials such as the director of Parks and Wildlife talking about siblings, the relatedness of the pelt that was then sent in by the alleged hunters that had held up this fox in front of the Longford Sign, sending in something. And the relatedness with the Bosworth fox, and it turns out under FOI in 2010 the Liberals get a document, or I should say Ivan Dean got a document to say that the Victorian Genomics Laboratory found no relationship whatsoever. The DNA was so degraded in all cases that it was unfit for showing any comparison. Yet somehow this adamancy that Peter Mooney took to the Earthbeat program was these animals were related, so we must have had a litter.
For 8 years before.
So these are the difficulties I have, because somebody has to admit somehow that the program had problems, and if you do that, then the issue of embezzlement becomes political embezzlement, because it's fabricated on the basis of assumptional analysis. At the very best, they have to concede that the program has run on assumptions rather than on defined logic analysis, and at the very worst, there has been fabrication of evidence.
Yep, which is kind of similar to a lot of government departments and places like forestry and such, you find exactly the same sort of stuff going on.
And that was the reason why I've kept it. That's the reason I've kept on with this one, because I have always felt that it was always difficult to convince people on a very confusing story that's run over. A lot of water's gone under the bridge. People don't want to go over the old storylines. It's too complex. You know, I can show you, I think I've got 9 scrapbooks of material. I've also got, you know, letters, and I've got a couple of compactus files full of documents. And it just shows that the complexity of going through this is time consuming. And I've done it because I think it's really about public policy and about how in a sense corrupted public policy can become, not because people do things intentionally, but because the system is so open to that anxiety to do something. You know, you're running ahead of yourself, and you know, public officials no longer have the time to do risk assessments any longer, or proper analyses. They rely on consultants spending lots of money to trawl over retrospectives, and usually by the time you do a retrospective, it's a bit like shutting the door after the horse has bolted. The money might still be there to bolt the door, and then you spend a lot of money trying to mop up. But in a sense, that's where I think flawed public policy on something like this is meritorious to do. And it's taking, you know, silly curmudgeons like me and others like Clive to just work on it, because I think it's worthwhile doing. I really.
Yes, ultimately some good will come out of it.
Yeah, and now with these collaborators with the Americans that have shown that these similar things have happened in America on a number of occasions, and they've looked at threatened species that have been detected in places where they were thought to be extinct. And there's a big along the thylacine analogy, where a lot of money has been placed into programs to validate what was anecdotal reports that were given to you know, bureaucratic organisations and government officials for good purpose, but corroboration has not happened. But it's sort of greased the wheels. So in a way, this isn't unique. This isn't like, you know, so out there and it's ridiculously stupid to be suggesting this. It's just I think it's been a problem because of the white-anting of individuals. I haven't been so badly white-anted, but I know Ian has suffered seriously from being challenged, and he's now, I personally think, you know, affected by it, because the trauma of having to feel, you know, that you're constantly not being trusted, and then people saying, oh, well, you know, produce the proof. And of course he then goes back to the people who've told him things, and they're saying, don't expect us to tell the story. We've got a reputation to keep, or we've got a job to keep, or we don't want to get on the bad side of somebody. So it becomes this hearsay thing that really discredits the whistleblower, and you're in a situation where it's a bit of a standoff. And Dean now is really the only person who is doing anything that can, and I think he's going to have a difficult road to hoe. The only way he can change the political process to allow for an investigation would be to convince Jim Wilkinson, who was the chair of the parliamentary inquiry that looked into this from a joint house assessment. And if Jim, who is a lawyer, blinks on this and says, I've got concerns, then I don't think there'll be any police inquiry. I think it'll be one where everybody will just be praying, particularly to Pee-wee, will be praying that this will just, everyone will go to bed and wake up on a brand new day where feral cats are now public enemy number one and foxes are being monitored.
Yes. Well, that's a good place to end, I think. Yes.
Whew.
Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, no pleasure.
I think that's all right.